Dober večer, dobrodošli na današnji znanstveni večer, ki je zadan v letu 2013 in upam, da tako kot vedno nekaj posebnega. It is my great pleasure and honor to have tonight with us Professor Diego De Leo. He is a professor of psychiatry and the director of the Australian Institute for Suicide Research and Prevention at the Griffith University in Brisbane. He is also the director of the Slovenskega Centra for Suicide Research, which was recently created at the University of Primorska in Koper. He is known as one of the world's leading psychiatrists that specialize in the suicide issue. Professor De Leo graduated at the medical faculty nearby, here close in Padova, and later he did his specialization in the psychiatry. He earned his doctorate at the University of Leiden in Netherlands. His research brought him many renowned international awards, including the award of the International Association for Suicide Prevention in 1991. But this year he was knighted by Queen Elizabeth II due to his scientific and research work in the medical field of psychiatry and his setting of the path for the activities geared towards suicide prevention and at national and international level. Professor De Leo is a co-founder of the International Academy of Suicide Research, an initiator of the World Suicide Prevention Day, and an editor-in-chief of the renowned international scientific journal named Crisis, the Journal of Crisis Intervention and Suicide Prevention. He is also the co-founder of the Slovenskega Centra for Suicide Research at the named by Andrej Marušič, so the Andrej Marušič Institute, which is located at the University of Primorska, which is the first such center in Slovenia and was founded in the memory of Professor Dr. Andrej Marušič. Well, the topic of today's lecture, of course, you probably guessed, is about the suicide and prevention of suicide. Please, Professor De Leo, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the introduction. Can you hear me okay? Thank you for allowing me to be here and to be here on Friday night instead of Thursday as is usual here, I understand. But I just came from overseas last night, so it was really beyond my capabilities to be here also last night. The Slovenskega Centre for Suicide Research, as briefly reminded you right now, was founded a couple of years ago. I hope this works. Do you have a remote control?
Must be somewhere, huh? That one.
Okay. To be directed where?
Let me try. Probably here, huh? No. Andrea.
That's essential.
We were not connected.
That's essential, thank you. There we go. We are much slimmer here, but this is the nucleus, the core of the Slovenskega Centre. You can maybe know this young lady who is very powerful, Vita Postovan. This is also very powerful, Janina Giberna, Tina and Ursha Mas, Tina Podlogar and Ursha Mas. Young, for sure, enthusiastic as well, and capable of entering in an important network, which is a world collaborating exercise from the WHO, from the World Health Organization, that gives the opportunity to Slovenia to create the basis for improving a lot suicide prevention research and permitting research to instruct the right prevention or a better prevention. Nothing is perfect in science, but we are getting there. Before describing this opportunity and what this opportunity entails, I want just to remind you that Europe is one of the areas in which suicide and psychiatric conditions, this is the bar of psychiatric conditions, and this is the bar of self-inflicted injuries. Suicide is an emergency, it's a great public health problem compared to other regions in which there are other issues and other priorities. And just to mention that one of the reasons why I am in Australia, which is part of the Western Pacific Regional Office of the WHO, is that suicide is also a big problem, and the biggest problem in the world is in that area in terms of both numbers and rates. Numbers because there is China, which in itself contributes, of course, a huge dimension, a huge number of suicide problems of the country. This is to indicate also that compared to homicides, the cycle and the rates in suicide, this is world, the latest comparison published by WHO 10 years ago and more, but still valid basically in terms of rates. You can see that the age increases with rates of suicide for suicide, but normally is not the same for homicide. And also, it's important to see that suicide is a prevailing problem for males, with a small but significant exception of girls in the youngest age group, from 5 to 14, where globally, where the rates are slightly higher for girls. For all the rest, it's always for males. In homicides, instead, the highest rates concern young toddlers, children, females in that age group. Of course, also, it's important to know that the relevance of suicide is huge in terms of rates in old age globally at the world level. The rate is the highest, but clearly as a cause of death is much less relevant in old age. On the contrary, is very important as a cause of death in young people, particularly in these age groups. 25 to 44 is the highest cause of mortality in both sexes, whilst as a cause of death, as you can see, it's much inferior to ischemic heart diseases or cerebrovascular disorder in both males and females when people reach the last part of life. This is a pretty recent statistic showing the distribution in terms of rates standardized, in this case, in the European Union. And the darker green areas indicate the countries with the highest rates. And unfortunately, Slovenia is in this group of countries together with Finland, the Baltic Republic, etc. So, for Slovenia, suicide is traditionally a big problem, a problem that fortunately, as you'll see better in a few minutes, is decreasing in severity, but still is very important. There are specificities that are embedded to many factors. It would be a big mistake to consider suicide just as a condition or a behavior embedded to mental disorders. Suicide is much more than that, and there are countries that have very different rates of suicidal behaviors, but very similar rates of mental disorders. So, for example, if you considered conditions such as schizophrenia, schizophrenia has pretty the same distribution all over the world, regardless the latitude and regardless the culture, so it's ubiquitous. However, there are countries that may have 40, 50 times differences in rates of suicide. And even in a small or comparatively small area like Europe, if we were considering, for example, males from Albania or males from Lithuania, we would see a huge difference. What explains this difference in rates are probably factors that, as I said, go beyond the mere psychiatric disorder evaluation, but have their roots in the culture, in the traditions, in the problem, in the use of alcohol, for example, in the political situation, in the financial situation, but especially in the tradition that exists in a country for what concerns dignity, honor, decision that life is worth to be lived, etc. And this is embedded with a system of traditional way of thinking and imitating behavior. So there are traditionally long-lasting differences, for example, between countries of the eastern part of Europe and the southern European countries. So there are huge differences from the Baltic Republic and Spain, Greece, Italy, for example, and the rates are very different. But as I said, if we were to consider the rates of depression, or even more convincingly, the rates of schizophrenia, we wouldn't find too many differences in this country. So this in itself addresses to a bigger landscape than the one embedded with mental disorders. Another peculiarity is that there are countries in which suicide peaks in old age, and this is also known as the European or the Chinese type of profile of suicide. And a country like the younger countries or the Pacific countries in which the peak is young age and then in old age suicide tend to disappear or being scantily present. And in any case, another element is that males have always high rates. Years ago, there were samples from China indicating that, particularly in rural areas, Chinese women could have higher rates than their male counterparts. This appears not to be true anymore, but it has been true for at least one decade of observations. We can see the position of Slovenia in this European list of countries, and in this table there were considerations paid to two different decades, and fortunately suicide in most countries is declining. So we are witnessing a global decline of suicide. I will tell you more again in a few minutes, but it's important to witness, for example, also a significant decrease in Slovenia. In some country like Estonia, the rate of suicide has been halved, so a huge decline. Good evening. And in most countries, as you can witness from this table, anyway, the prevailing information is that suicide has been declining. This is an old couple of tables from the World Health Organization, and these have been quoted so many times in articles, in journals, in textbooks, etc. And this concerns the rate of suicide in half a century, basically, from 1950 to the end of the century, of the previous century, showing an increase, a massive increase of the order of 60% of male suicide rates, while there was an increase, but not that marked, in females. The same group of researchers, headed by José Bertolotti in Geneva, to which I also collaborated, showed prediction for a further increase. In 2002, when the graph was first produced, the WHO estimated is different from counting. It's an estimate based on projection more than on real actual figures, but estimated that there were approximately 900,000 suicide cases in the world, and estimated that this number was going to increase by 50% and more by 2020. Fortunately, also WHO and myself, we do mistakes, and so the projection appears not to be true. But before examining again better the failed projection, or at least what looks to be a failed projection, let's also examine that the distribution in the world of suicide is esteemed to be different and is reported to be different. For example, the present situation, see again the Western Pacific area as the highest for suicide rates, followed by the European region. Southeastern in Asia is the third block, and the projection is for a substantial stability of rates in Europe, but for a major, or anyway, a marked increase in the Western Pacific region. One element that comes from a very important study, something huge that has put together more than 300 scholars around the world, the best brains probably, is called the Global Burden of Disease study. Maybe some of you have heard about this study, which means, among the many things, calculating how much a condition costs to the community, of how much the quality of life years is affected by conditions, and it's a series of calculations that bring to many indications for the future. The study has been conceived by Christopher Murray at the time of his presence in WHO, and he made, I apologize, the first evaluation in 1990, when the world population was a bit more than 5 billion people. He repeated the exercise in 2010 data and published last year, 1 year ago. Lancet has dedicated an issue specifically to this study, to the result of this study. And the population in the world has grown by more than 1.5 billion inhabitants. The good news from the calculation of the GBD, the Global Burden of Disease study, is that even if the number of suicide cases has been counted to be 880,000 compared to the previous 670,000, so a remarkable increase, the population has also increased, so the rates have been more or less the same. What has been instead increasing more has been the number of injuries related to road deadly injuries, and this is due especially to the developing countries' contribution. Road accidents have been steadily decreasing in high-income countries. This is good because of and a good consequence of the many prevention activities that are dedicated and have been dedicated to road accidents. Is it all clear to you? Are you following right? Say yes?
Yes.
Good. Thank you. I was telling you about the prediction and the reality of suicide. So in last year, we produced with the same people in WHO a revision of the 2002 edition of data, and we could witness on the 62 countries that were able to provide data on a continuing basis to WHO in a reliable way, apart from guaranteeing continuity, that actually suicide has been declining, and has been declining overall in males, has been declining also in females in a less marked way, but also in females the numbers, the figures are smaller. If you consider the line here of 0, you can see that all ages for males have been witnessing a decrease, particularly marked in elderly men in the age group 65 to 74. And the only increase in rates of suicide has been in young girls up to the age of 15, excluded. So from 5 to 14, this is the only age group in female subjects that has recorded an increase in rate of suicide. On the other, all the other have been really decreasing rates. We don't know why this is happening, to be honest. Of course, some believe that it is because of the prevention activities, because of the improvement of the health conditions, because of the improvement of level of care, public assistance, and certainly this has a role. As a matter of fact, at the world level, particularly for those countries that are recording data, in general, quality of life has been improving for people, giving access to more opportunities for living free entrepreneurship, more money, more tourism, more freedom in general, and this has probably translated into reduced mortality to suicide. If we want to be very updated and having reliable data as checked by WHO, you can see that at the world level here, we have Slovenia still very high for males. So this is something that is politically incorrect, presenting this kind of classification for the highest rates of suicide, but it's something that it's important to let people know about that, and it gives an opportunity to see where you're ranking, where you stay, how to assess the importance of the problem, the extent and the dimension of suicide in your countries. These are more countries, and you cannot even notice, for example, in these two slides concerning males, a neighboring country like Italy, which is my country of origin, and because rates of suicide are lower, much lower. And for females, Slovenia still ranks pretty high, but at a lower level than Finland, which was lower before in males, still very high, but here is smaller in the dimension. But still the problem, it's very big. Again, you cannot notice in this slide Italy again, so there is something very bad in terms of political and financial situation of the country, but still the country does reasonably good in terms of suicide rates. This is another angle to assess and evaluate data on suicide, because there are countries in which the ratio males to females is very big, so the gap is very marked. Here we have Belize, for example, where suicide is nearly 10 times more common in males than in females, and then Slovakia, Poland, etc. And on the other hand, there are countries here where the ratio is much closer, and we can see a series of Asian countries from Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, which has been a country in which suicide has been increasing a lot in the past decades. Okay. Now, let's try to enter in the main argument of the night, the WHO study, why it's useful for Slovenia to enter the study. This WHO exercise has been done essentially because many countries still do not report data on mortality to WHO. Many of these countries don't record mortality at all for anything, not only suicide. Some countries don't record suicide. Some countries have, say, a particular way of recording data. Not all have the same system. You can have coroners, you can have public officers, you can have police, you can have a registration which is partial and based on health-related data, etc. In any case, in 2005, in Manila, WHO hosted a meeting which was stimulated essentially by the increasing rates of suicide in many countries of the area of the Western Pacific, and invited me to act as a consultant for a month in preparation of this meeting. And there were 22 countries participating and asking for something to be done for the intervention of the WHO. The WHO had at least 2 previous exercises that saw me involved, and both were very successful exercises, multi-center studies, feeding a lot of cooperation among countries, a lot of learning, a lot of training for people, etc. And one was run entirely in Europe, and the other was run in the 5 continents, called the Supremis study, the suicide prevention, multi-site intervention study in suicide. The main issue is, okay, let's improve data recording. Let's understand the baseline of suicide, what is the exact dimension of the phenomenon. Let's try to promote research, hoping that research may promote more knowledge and then instruct, inform suicide prevention in a better way. The study has been difficult. It has been proposed during that meeting. It took approximately 2 to 3 years to agree on protocol, translate, back translate, adapt to cultural situation, the materials, and then it entered in a full regime in late 2008 at the beginning, involving a number of countries from the Western Pacific region only. But then the study raised the interest of other countries, and so WHO last year declared the global status of the study, which has 4 components. All countries participating to the studies needs to do the recording of their data and needs to be able to provide not only data on suicide, data that should be obtained in a standardized way, but also they have to be able to provide data on non-fatal suicidal behavior, suicide attempts, or other sort of self-injuries. People perform self-violence, acting in different ways with different intentions, but we need to understand what they do and hopefully why they do and try to find solution for them. A second component includes a randomized controlled study of non-fatal suicidal behavior. This is run in emergency departments where normally people go for being amended, repaired, somatically amended. And in these emergency departments, people may have the opportunity to accept being enrolled in a study that involves a very small type, small in the sense of doable, feasible and not expensive type of intervention that will continue through 18 months of follow-up, of supervision. And so it will give the opportunity to people to be, not continuously, but in a continuing manner, to be in contact with the health facilities that took care of them. The third component is what is called psychological autopsy, which is a system post hoc after a death has occurred to get information about the possible circumstances that preceded the event, who was the person that died by suicide, what were the possible causative factors, and informants are normally the proxies of that people, a spouse or children or parents anyway, and they possibly provide also sometimes conflicting information. Sometimes they project their own motives in case they were contemplating suicide. Sometimes they really know only what they had experienced about the person and they know very little about the person. But this is the best way we have today for collecting data on suicide cases, and so it's a very important and innovative way of doing research in suicide, and is quite widely adopted. The fourth component is instead paying particular care of those who made a serious suicide attempt. So their intention was actually to die in some way, and they made to themselves something violent or serious, such as to provoke at least a coma, or some injury, or survive just by chance to a death that was intentional. I would say that this sample of people provides, actually, if they were selected carefully, a magnificent opportunity to study suicide, because in this case, it is the actor, the person that did the attempt to speak to you and to tell you what they were planning or intended to do, instead of informants that may have their own views or limited knowledge of what happened. So they represent the best possible proxy to suicide, and so they can be people particularly informative about the occurrence of suicide. So we need to pay particular attention to them. The study involves the collection of a database. We need to create a register of the cases, the register for both suicide and attempted suicide. The data then collected in the same way happen to be united in a common pooled data set, which is important in suicide because suicide is possibly the worst of human tragedies, but is still to be considered a rare event. So it is very frequent not to have studies powered statistically enough to permit serious degrees of inference and generalize the data results. Putting together data from different countries, even considering the differences in cultural tradition, as I said before, but clearly increases the possibilities of having researches powered enough to permit more reliable extrapolations. And we have fixed for this information a number of records that needs to be common to everybody, and this is the minimum data set that needs to be provided. These are definitions for suicide. We don't have international definitions, and I'm honored now to precede a task force, which is IASPO, International Association for Suicide Prevention, and WHO task force that will provide help in creating possibly an internationally applicable glossary for suicide and suicide-related phenomena. So we wanted to provide criteria for suicide ideation, up to criteria for assisted suicide, euthanasia, or bereavement. So if we were able to use the same language, we could compare results from different countries. But if we keep going with different nomenclature and terminologies, researches are difficult to compare, and so it's nearly impossible to cluster and to group data. So, for example, even in a country like Australia, if you look through the data which are recorded, we have a system in Queensland, for example, that is very good. It's called EDIS, and it registers in a computerized way all entries in emergency departments. But the problem is that if you wanted to look for suicide attempt or non-fatal suicidal behavior, you find 23 types of different records. So unless you have personnel, resources, and motivation to try to extrapolate the data, even a simple counting of this phenomena becomes very difficult to be done. So it's important to use the same terminology, and you may have in this very country, in Slovenia, an habit to call them suicide attempts, also if they are not really suicide attempts, in the sense that there is no real intention to die, but there are several other intentions, like manipulation of the environment, expressing rage, relieving tension, wanting to escape from an unbearable situation, and so on. So there are many different intentions. You may be aware that there are countries like most Anglo-Saxon countries in which there is a more generic definition of self-harm or deliberate self-harm, etc. And today there are new terminologies like non-suicidal self-injury as proposed by American colleagues, or a WHO definition for non-fatal suicidal behavior. Are you done? Are you tired? You tell me, you're sleeping, REM phase? You still with me?
Still.
I'll be finished in 5 minutes.
5-10 minutes.
5 minutes.
Yeah.
So not only there are discrepancies, but there are also bad terminologies, in the sense that they are sometimes reflective of an attitude which can be a culturally or religiously embedded type of attitude, and can be, for example, judging the act like committed suicide. To commit suicide gives the sense of a criminal behavior and is reminiscent of a situation in which the suicide was criminalized. And there are still more than 20 countries in the world where there are laws against suicide, so where suicide is a criminal act and a criminal behavior. So if you attempt suicide and you survive, you have good opportunities to go to prisons. And, but there are countries at this time. Then there are many other more or less correct terminologies that may be confusing or may take different meanings in countries where, for example, the use of Latin-derived idioms is not popular or is not typical of the area, and so the meanings tend to be a bit sparse or diverse from the origin, etc. For example, the European group that guided, including myself, the multi-center study in Europe with 35 centers involved, which was a gigantic study, thought that, for example, we needed a nomenclature. This problem is a long-lasting problem, so there were many attempts to uniform the nomenclature, and we thought that parasuicide at that time was a good term to oppose attempted suicide. But then we went quite wrong, because in reality, in practical life, it created more misleading judgments and categories than advantages. So it ended by being two terms instead of one, two of them interchangeable or even mutually exclusive, or one subcategory of the other, meaning that it was a lighter form of suicide attempt, or even vice versa. So a very chaotic and disorganized environment. This is a definition that was adopted after that study involving the concept that non-fatal suicidal behavior is a form of non-habitual act. So we wanted to exclude, for example, repeated self-cutting. I don't know if you are aware, but self-cutting in many Western countries is increasing a lot, and is increasing a lot particularly because internet is diffusing this culture, and because there are many sites in which you can witness video clips of cutting, and people teach you how to cut you best, and how to bleed more profusely, how to cut yourself and not being discovered by the others, or covering with clothing and in an appropriate way. So it's very difficult to control the internet, and due to internet of course brings incredible advantages and incredible changes in the life of every individual, but there are also disadvantages, and clearly one of these is the access to information and to methods that in the past were non-existing. The next is a slide that concerns an agreement about a nomenclature that is adopted even in the START study, just to uniform judgments and to mean something altogether. It's important that we have the same direction and the same intention in defining things. Just to remind you that this category of non-fatal suicidal behavior wants to be the simplest possible, not the most perfect, but the simplest and the most applicable, in the sense that it's just outcome-based. You don't pay attention to the intention, because the intention will be, and examining the intention, tomorrow tasks. So the outcome-based observation considers essentially if the subject is still alive or if the subject died. So you need to be aware that the behavior was self-initiated, and that there were, in one case, no intention to die, but there were other intentions, as I said, for example, escaping the situation, sleeping, expressing rage. In that case, you can still die, but as a consequence of the act, but the act was not wanted in these fatal terms, so it was an accidental death. Or there can be some intention to die accompanied also by other intentions. So you can have the simultaneous presence of multiple intentions, and the intention to die can be minimal, but still is present, and is defined a non-fatal suicidal behavior. And in order to calculate costs and other parameters, it's important to know if there were injuries that needed to be treated or not without injuries. Look, I would have many other slides and talks to you. Maybe just to tell you that in these START studies, at this point in time, there are 25 countries involved, and these give the opportunity to know about very diverse realities and dimensions. If you agree, I would stop here, and I'd be happy to respond to your question before you fall asleep, definitely, and and go home to celebrate your starting of the weekend. Thank you very much for listening so much.
Well, thank you very much for the excellent lecture and the very clear presentation of the problems with suicide research. Well, before we give the floor to the public, I would take the opportunity to ask you a question. Well, looking at the suicide rate within Europe, very naively, one would expect that the rate would be higher in the south and lower in the north.
Why?
Well, I mean, the life in the south is a little bit more chaotic than in the north. And
it's more
the
fun.
The north is more organized, but it's vice versa. I mean, is there any, let's say, simple explanation for that, or is simply the suicide, it's an act which is too complicated to understand?
A suicide is far away from being simple. There are many factors, including possibly something that concerns your field of research, physics. So there could be the influence of the sun, there could be the influence of the heat and the temperature, there could be the possibilities of spending life outside home, so having more opportunities of interacting and creating a relationship, while if the weather and the climate is severe, you're forced to be protected and indoor, and this is trivially one explanation. Suicide is very, very close to the idea that if you are physically and emotionally isolated, your opportunities will be very reduced. On the contrary, if you have the opportunity to be out and to even to show warning signs that can be picked up by other people, you have more opportunity to be rescued and to be helped by people. But if there is nobody out there, what sort of warning sign can you pick up? You have nobody picking up your warning signs. So it's important also to be in a populated environment. For example, worldwide, population is different in terms of suicidality if it's a rural environment or a metropolitan environment. And today, big metropolitan environments are much more protective than rural environments. So people that live in big cities are more protected, have more opportunities to be helped, to be identified as suffering or needing help than in rural, isolated communities. So I don't know if it's partly answering what you wanted to ask. Yeah. That certainly is a complex issue.
It's complex, yeah. Questions from the audience? Manisha, yes.
Hello. Since the reason to do suicide, they are very diverse. So are there, there are institutes where they can, people can study the kind of mentality of the people who commit suicide like that. But are there any ways to control, or there are any awareness programs that can help people?
If I understood correctly, your question is you wanted to know if raising awareness, for example, or telling people, educating people can be helpful. It is absolutely helpful. That's why we have the World Day for Suicide Prevention, which is on 10th of September every year. It's a way to to speak about suicide and create programs, create helplines, create fora, chat rooms, or programs to educate people to counteract suicidality, or to help them, or to let them know that there are other people that can help, that they are not left alone. So we can do a lot, and we are trying to do things. It's never enough, but it's better surely than keeping everything under the carpet and pretend that nothing is happening. So yes, we have to.
Tamara.
Yes, thank you very much. It was really very impressive lecture on this issue, which I'm not that familiar. But I have two questions. First would be related to what Professor Zavrtanik already started to ask you. You made a lot of observational studies in different categories of suicidal behavior, but you probably have, you haven't shown here, made also analytical studies to correlate these frequencies of suicidal rate with some risk factors in these particular areas linked to either the social behavior of an area or with the genetics of the population or with any other risks that would be relevant for particular types of these behaviors. If you have, do you have some explanation for the Slovenian really exceptional high suicide rate?
Well, not me, but Andrej Marusic had an explanation from Slovenia. He thought that there was some genetic heritage, and he depicted a geographic area starting from the Agrafin and going down, passing through Austria, Slovenia, a J curve he depicted, which was embedded to the old tradition of consuming alcohol, and a certain population to be quite fierce in their behavior and tendentially more violent than others. So there was a kind of epigenetic information on that. Certainly, countries where the use of alcohol is traditionally present and the abuse of alcohol, because we need to distinguish between use and abuse. Yes. And so there are countries in which the use per capita is very high, but is embedded with food, for example. Like Italy, France, are countries with very high per capita use of alcohol, but low abuse of alcohol. So it seems paradoxical, but those countries that produce a lot of wine, for example, tend to have very low rates of alcohol abuse. Italy has a very low rate of alcohol abuse disorders and a very low rate of suicide in general. Certainly, there are countries in which the political situation is such that in some way suicide may become one choice, so to speak, or life conditions are so unbearable that people may prefer to end their life that become hopeless or without any option for a change. I concur with you that instead of having general demographic tables, it would be, there are similar tables, but not that widespread or popular table in which rates are homologated to risk factors, or particularly to one main risk factor, like for example, alcohol abuse. This is certainly existing. And you can know that Russia, for example, Finland, Ukraine, many ex-Soviet bloc nations have still very high rates of suicide, and alcohol is very widespread, is very present, and clearly there are many phenomena that are related to alcohol, not just suicide, but also homicide, domestic violence, work-related accidents, road accidents, etc., poor performances at work. So these are all problems that are related to excessive alcohol consumption. We can do a lot in this field. We can do a lot. So one of the hopes that we have is try to educate or re-educate people, and helping also suicide prevention in this direction. This was question one. Question two.
Second is more perhaps shorter. You have shown, as I understood, the increase of suicidal rate with that it's increasing in general, especially in males. So you predict more increase because of, and this is of course due to the always occurring in older age. So there is an aging population all over the world, and do you think that this increase, predicted increase of rate,
was strongly influenced by that?
Is influenced by just the result of the aging population, so that's why it's more.
This was
that somehow normalized by age of the population.
This is a very good question, and certainly we were very influenced by this idea. So we made a kind of simple, probably too simple equation. Suicide is the highest in old age, the elderly population is growing, in all the world. Not only that, but also the life span is extending. So additional reasons to die by suicide in this age group, fortunately, is not happening. And in my view now, I'll be wrong again, but in my view now, there are even more options that the elderly of tomorrow will be very different from the elderly of today. So differently educated people with different set of values and skills, and possibly the capacity of further reducing rates of suicide in old age. So overall contributing even less to the total amount of suicide, hopefully. Keeping finger crossed.
This intriguing, let's say, regional distribution which goes from north to south, almost straight down from Finland to Slovenia, is a bit
impressive.
Impressive, yeah, quite interesting. But so it's very difficult to explain differences in Finland and Slovenia in this terms of environmental, let's say, impacts or physical impacts that you have mentioned. Mm-hmm. But on the other side, you have mentioned several times Italy as one of the lowest rates, and that's also a relatively long country going from north to south. Do you have any information on the differences between northern Italy and southern Italy?
I do have. Well, the north of Italy is much higher in suicide rates. It's nearly European. And the south of Italy is very low in general in rates of... So you have a gradient of suicidality which is higher in the north, middle in the center of the country, and lower in the south. I am used to quote the example of Naples, which is an incredible city, and I love it very much. But it's incredible because Naples could have had, for example, the highest rate of homicides in the world for one specific year, but the lowest rate of suicide in the world. So I remember the year, possibly 2004, in which Naples had these very high rates of homicide, but also had nearly one case of suicide every 100,000 people. So a very, very low rate of suicide. Why is that so? The first easy explanation, probably too easy, is that it is impossible or nearly impossible to be socially isolated in Naples. So it's a very type of talkative culture, and which is very protective. So if you know everything of everybody, then you give the opportunity to help everybody and to be helped by everybody. Possibly you can't control the gossiping, but on the other side, you receive a lot of help and support. And social support is a magic word in suicide environment. So if you have people able to help you or to understand you, or even if they don't understand you, but to be there for you, that's enough. And for clinicians, for people who are aware what really means to be at risk or at extreme risk of suicide, they have learned from practicing that for people who are considering to die, it's important to know that someone cares. It may be not the most skilled physicians or psychologists or psychotherapists, doesn't matter, but what matters is that there is someone out there willing to help, willing to care. This is the message, and basically Naples reminds me of this opportunity, so it's... Is it okay with you?
According to your experience, what is the role of age-associated cognitive decline or preclinical phases of dementia, such as mild cognitive impairment, in suicidal behavior?
Very low. So there is no scientific evidence to support an association between dementia and suicidal behavior. However, there are cultural factors that may make the difference. For example, there are attitudes and habits in countries that are very diverse. In Anglo-Saxon countries, for example, physicians are in a way forced to state the diagnosis, and in other countries the habit is more prudent, or even denying, for example, the presence of cancer, even at very last, always providing the care, but the diagnosis is not so clearly stated. But I may quote that the first case of Dr. Kevorkian in the United States was a lady who was also a piano player that realized that something went wrong because she couldn't remember music. And she asked for being, after being declared an Alzheimer patient, she asked Dr. Kevorkian to be helped to die. And this was the first case of euthanasia through the death machine of Dr. Kevorkian. The sad story is that at the autopsy level on the body of this lady, whose name, if I'm not wrong, was Janet Atkins, was that, and she was quite young, she was in her 50s, so not advanced age, was that there was no trace of Alzheimer's dementia then. And so it could have been a mistake also, or a transitory condition. But in any case, in a researcher, and also my group when I was in Italy performed a multi-center study through GPs and trying to establish Alzheimer in itself, unless they are the very initial stages in which people still keep some degree of awareness and can make a decision concerning life, but then clearly when the disease advances, there is no issue, there is no suicide at all, actually. Milady.
I believe that similar as south and north, there is also a difference between the different periods in the year. So in winter there are many more suicides than in summer, for example, and in vacation time more than in other time of the year. So for example, this period right now.
In the northern hemisphere or in the southern?
No, in general. There is.
Look, no, actually. In the northern hemisphere, where we are now,
Yeah.
Yesterday I was in another hemisphere, but today I'm here, and in the northern hemisphere we have two peaks, seasonal peaks. One is late spring, and the other is autumn. The most marked is the end of April and the beginning of May. So these concentrate the highest rates of suicide in the northern hemisphere, historically proven. And probably in parallel with the circadian and ultra-circadian seasonal rhythms and biorhythms embedded, for example, to serotonin which is an important neurotransmitter that regulates many functions, but including mood. And so depression can have a couple of peaks during the year. In the southern hemisphere, there is a peak that mostly corresponds to our late springtime and is end of November, beginning of December. So this time of the year is the worst in the southern hemisphere, where it is reversed, clearly. Now is summer there, and here we are in winter. But there is no evidence of a second peak, quite curiously. Of course, research from the southern hemisphere is much rarer than the northern hemisphere, so before stating with absolute clarity or with a firm degree that there are no two peaks in the southern hemisphere, probably we should wait for more research. But recently there were studies from Brazil and South Africa, apart from the traditional. We have just published in Australia also a study on seasonal condition and days of the week, because Monday is still the worst day of the week, also for suicide. So the Monday syndrome really exists, and is particularly marked for men, possibly also for numerical, statistical reasons, because suicide in males is much more prevailing. But still, the day of the week in which people kill themselves is more frequently Monday. I'm sorry to disappoint you.
Any other question? Please.
Very quickly, are there at the moment epidemiological studies investigating the relationship between eating disorders and suicidal behavior?
Eating disorder? Yes. There are correlation, particularly between the worst eating disorder condition, which is nervosa anorexia, more than bulimia, and actually anorexia is a robust risk factor for suicide. There is an ongoing debate on suicide in anorexia, in the sense that many want to imagine that also the pathological self-feeding is in itself a suicidal form of behavior. But apart from entering in this speculation or interpretation, when people die deliberately, intentionally, with all the basic characters for defining it, suicide, so the intentionality, the awareness of the fatal, the lethal destiny of their action, etc., and initiate the behavior, I would say that yes, suicide in anorexia nervosa is unfortunately higher than in the general population.
Some more questions? Well, if not, maybe I will ask the last one. This male-female suicide ratio, it's very different. It goes from 1 to 10, if I remember correctly.
Yes, correct.
Is there a geographical pattern, maybe, which is followed by this, or is more or less randomly distributed all over the world? Or?
Not geographically determined. You have seen that Belize, for example, was the country with the highest disproportion, and many Asian countries, those closer to 1 instead. So I wouldn't say the geography, I would say that primarily is the culture that influences these discrepancies or these particular ratio. And the fact that it's pretty homogeneous in Asian countries, from China, where even there was an inversion of the ratio, at least what was reported from data in the 90s. But Singapore, Taiwan have nearly the same. The Philippines are also very close to each other. So it's more the way of thinking of people, the tradition, than what counts. Other disproportion, of which I didn't speak about, is the ratio between elderly and youth in the population of suicide. So there are countries like Hungary, for example, Portugal, where the number of the elderly, the rates of the elderly are 10 times those of young people. But in Anglo-Saxon countries, there is a tendency towards a bimodal curve and ratios that are close to 1:1. And if you had the opportunity to see those tables, you reinforce the idea of cultural influences on suicide, because it's really typical of all Anglo-Saxon countries, being the United States, South Africa, Canada, or Australia. The ratio is nearly 1:1. But other countries, Latin countries in particular, the elderly are very high in rate and young people very low. So I would say that more than geography, it's tradition and culture that make the difference.
Any other question? Well, if not, let's thank again Professor De Leo for a very nice, a very excellent, very explanatory talk. We are very happy to have you here. And I would like at the end to invite you not to leave us, but to join us at the ground floor, and we will have more possibilities for discussions and questions if needed. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.